Okay, hi. This video is about, is olive oil good for you? And we're starting out here with a picture of the bed of Odysseus and Penelope. So Odysseus, after he was in the Trojan War, he wandered for another 10 years with a new woman on every island before he made it home to Penelope, good, faithful Penelope, and the whole story of that from The Idiot and the Oddity. I enjoyed it. Okay, anyways. Oh, and why am I showing it to you? Hold on a second. Why am I showing this? Because their bed was built around an olive tree, and we're going to talk about olive oil. And I have some Greek friends, and they get mad if I say anything negative about olive oil. But anyways, here it goes. Hey, what's this going down here? I got to go here. Sorry a sec. I got to get to the... Okay, real quick, just a brief bit of biochemistry to make everything clear for everybody. Saturated fat has no double bonds. Here's a saturated fat molecule. The carbon tail, this is the methyl end with just a methyl group at the end here of carbons, is hydrophobic or nonpolar. Then there's a carboxylic acid at the other end, which is polar, because the oxygens have a stronger electron pull than does the hydrogen. So whenever you got oxygens next to a hydrogen or next to a carbon, you're going to have a polar segment. Here is a MUFA. A MUFA means monounsaturated fatty acid, and that's your typical olive oil. It'll have one double bond, and it's a C18, meaning 18 carbons, and then colon, and then number 1, meaning the number of double bonds, and then W is the same sign for omega. So that means W9, the double bond is at the 9th carbon. So that would be counting from the methyl end. Always count from the methyl end. Carbon number 9, that's the double bond where it'll be located with a MUFA olive oil. Okay, a PUFA means polyunsaturated fatty acid. So a polyunsaturated fatty acid has 2 or more double bonds. And the 2 essential ones, there's only 2 essential ones, is linoleic acid, C18, 2 with 2 double bonds, and that's an omega-6. And then alpha-linolenic acid is with 3 double bonds. Okay, as far as the unsaturation, the saturated fat right here, typical most common one is palmitic acid or palmitate. You just pronounce the ending in ATE when it's deprotonated, as they routinely are in aqueous solution. So palmitic acid is the same thing essentially as palmitate for our purposes. MUFA, like oleic acid, olive oil, is going to have 1 double bond, as we spoke about. And you can count these carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that would be an omega-6. But ours is going to be omega-9 with oleic acid. Okay, now here's the big thing that's good to know. This is actually really important. In a PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid, there's always a carbon in between the 2 double bonds that does not have a double bond on it. And that carbon is called the methylene bridge, because it's called a methylene group when you got a carbon with 2 hydrogens coming off it. And it has a weaker hold on its hydrogen than the hydrogens at other locations. The more double bonds a fatty acid has, the more prone it is to oxidation and lipid peroxidation, where this hydrogen is plucked off, and then oxygen can bind to that site, form peroxyl radicals, and lead to chain reactions of fatty acid damage, especially in plasma membranes. So it can destroy plasma membranes, mitochondrial membranes. That's actually a very big deal. And that's actually one of the main reasons why I think it's a bad idea to be having these omega-3 supplements and to be eating these oils because of these lipid peroxidation issues. They are more common than is widely realized. Okay, olive oil. What is olive oil? So when we think of olive oil, we think of omega-9 fat, oleic acid. Olea is the Latin word for olive, by the way. But olive oil is it's not pure just oleic acid. There's typically some palmitic acid in there in the ballpark of 13%, according to my nutrition books. But I know there's some variations in the amount of purification of it and whatnot, but in that ballpark. So it contains a significant amount of saturated fat. It also contains some omega-6 fat and then a tiny bit of omega-3 fat. You know, people talk about their omega-6, omega-3 ratios. Well, olive oils, in the ballpark of 10 to 1 more omega-6 than omega-3 for what that's worth. And it's got sat fat in it too. What's unique about olive oil? The unique thing about it is that it's an omega-9. Saturated fat has no double bonds, and then your typical cooking oils are omega-6s, which there's all kinds of problems with those. And then there's some relatively rare omega-3s. You can get omega-3s rarely, places like from flaxseed, or you can get them from fish oil supplements and all that. But anyway, so that's unique about olive oil. It's a MUFA, monounsaturated fatty acid. And there's some benefit in that, in the sense that, when you have a polyunsaturated fatty acid, you're much more vulnerable to lipid peroxidation because you got that methylene bridge, which is very vulnerable to being oxidized, whereas not so much with a MUFA. And with sat fat, almost never. You can forget about it with sat fat. It's not going to get lipid peroxidized. Okay, why is olive oil so popular? The main reason it's so popular, it's got great advertising. I mean, the name extra virgin olive oil sounds like you're winning a bride, Probably better to use it as a lubricant than eat it. Okay, that's a bad joke. What's bad about olive oil? It's all liquid fat. You don't want to eat anything that's liquid fat. It's got 9 calories per gram. It's the highest possible caloric density. The higher the percent of calories from fat, the more likely the person is to get fat, become obese. Daily intakes of these highly processed food, these oils, greatly increases the risk of a person becoming obese. All oils are associated with increased atherosclerosis. I know omega-3s can lower triglycerides, but they all tend to push towards obesity and all these other problems. Olive oil does raise postprandial triglycerides, as do the omega-6 cooking oils. Olive oil is also associated with reduced flow mediated vasodilation by 31% at 3 hours. Now, that 31% number comes from a study by Robert Vogel done in 2000. It's a pretty famous study, postprandial effect of components of Mediterranean diet on endothelial function. Journal of the American College of Cardiology. So you're welcome to look this up. It's a free paper. And I put a whole bunch of references in there. Anybody wants to look them up, go ahead. You'll see. The more you read about it, the less you're going to want to eat olive oil. Okay, so what's my problem with this paper? They obtained the data at 3 hours postprandial. Later on, we'll look at a graph, and my prediction is there's going to be a lot more impairment of blood flow at 5 or 6 hours than at 3 hours. With sat fat, you typically peak at about 5 hours in hyperlipidemia, and then it'll come down by around 8 hours. Whereas with polyunsaturated fatty acids, the hyperlipidemia persists more than 9 hours. So I don't know exactly when the peak is, but that'll suggest it's going to be at later than 5 hours. And so what I'm saying is if they would have tested it later than 3 hours, I'll bet you they would have found a lot more flow-mediated dilation. So what I'm basically saying too is that study was almost, it sounds to me, designed to not make it look bad, and it still looks bad. Okay, and then the Lyon heart study is quoted as showing cardioprotective effects of the Mediterranean diet, but they're a joke. I mean, in comparison to the Esselstyn diet, it's about 40 times better. The Esselstyn diet in 4 years, there were 99.4% of patients with no recurrent cardiovascular events. And, in comparison, the Lyon study had like 25% major cardiovascular events, MI, stroke, death, and whatnot. And Esselstyn says the only patient who didn't have it in his study is one who didn't really follow the diet. It's a guy who had a recurrent event. Okay, other studies. Silva study here, olive, soybean, and palm oils have a similar detrimental effect on endothelial function. And there's your reference. All oils increased plasma triglycerides. Same thing with the Vogel study. All the oils increased plasma triglycerides, which is a atherosclerosis risk factor. Blankenhorn, 1978, did a study. Blankenhorn in 1978 did a study on the rate of atherosclerosis change during treatment of hyperlipoproteinemia. And the key finding was with cardiac cath follow-up, that's pretty invasive, intense follow-up. At 3 years, saturated fat, MUFA, PUFA, they all had significant increases in new atherosclerotic lesion. There was no big benefit from any variation of which fat you were eating. And to prevent coronary artery disease, the person needs to reduce their total fat intake. And, by the way, Dr. McDougall has a real nice summary of this in his book, Start Solution, on page 136. So this is well-known stuff. But I think it's good for you to have heard of all this because you're going to keep on hearing strange things from people. Oh, olive oil is good for you and cardioprotective or whatever, good for your brain. I disagree with all that. Here's the papers to help you if you ever feel like you need to get more information to solidify your opinion and whatnot. But there's good information to suggest you shouldn't eat any oil. None of them, including I recommend avoid all the omega-3s too. I recommend stay away from all this stuff. Oil is highly processed stuff. It's not a naturally occurring food. Adam and Eve could not eat this stuff. Okay, Rudell's paper, MUFAs and atherosclerosis. Basically, in animals, the MUFA diets were not atheroprotective. There was an African green monkey study. African green monkeys are thought to have metabolism somewhat similar to humans. And again, no atheroprotective effect with diet, more MUFA, monounsaturated fatty acid. Okay, here's some of the graphs on hyperlipidemia. You feed them saturated fat, that's the black line here. It'll peak at about 5 hours. And this was done by Peter Kuo, a cardiologist from Philadelphia. And he found that he did this with cardiac angina patients. At peak lipemia at 5 hours, they had the most frequent and the most intense episodes of cardiac angina, chest pain, consistent with the ischemia being due to the hyperlipemia. Ray Rosenman, Meyer Friedman did some great experiments using primarily a microscope placed over the eye, 80 times magnification, and they saw similar patterns of diminished blood flow. Kuo repeated his experiments, and Friedman and Rosenman also repeated the experiments and checked them with unsaturated fatty acids. What they found was the unsaturated fatty acids had a prolonged hyperlipemia. And it did not go away at 8-9 hours. It persisted through 9 hours. The experimenters were getting tired. It was a long day for them. So what I'm basically saying is these unsaturated fatty oils were worse. Okay, here's just a quick trick if you're interested in how to memorize them really fast. It's easy. So O for oleic is like O for number 1, and you can remember it as 1 double bond. All right. La, that's 2 letters, linoleic acid, 2 double bonds. Alpha linoleic acid, ALA, 3 letters, 3 double bonds. Okay, arachidonic acid, I just remember the first 4 letters, Arach, 4 double bonds. Icosapenta, penta means 5 double bonds. Docosahexaenoic acid, hexa is 6 double bonds. And again, oleic is the main component of olive oil, about 73% of the fatty acids in olive oil. Okay, now is olive oil good for you? And I can tell you, whenever I hear about a 100% vegan having coronary artery disease problems, it's almost always because of oil. I'll just tell you a story. I have a friend, he's an Indian doctor, very nice guy, and he's real thin. And I didn't see him for a couple months, and then I saw him, and I'm like, hey, how's it going? Where you been? And he said, oh, I covered it up with this picture. I said, where you been? He said, well, I was dead. I go, what do you mean you were dead? He said he had a heart attack. He coded. He was resuscitated, had a coronary artery stent placed. And I said, I thought you were a vegetarian. He said, I am. I said, well, then it must be oils. You put oil in your food? And he's like, yeah, you need that for cooking. I said, no, you don't. It was the oils. There's no other reason why this guy should have had a heart attack. Okay, he's a healthy, energetic guy. But it's sad. I mean, he's doing okay, but I'm sure he wishes he hadn't had that experience. And we talked about that before. You can't completely outrun a bad diet. And we talked about the Jim Fixx, death from myocardial infarction. He was the marathon runner, editor of a running magazine, author of the book, Complete Book of Running. Alberto Salazar, like world champion marathon runner, he had a myocardial infarction similar to the situation with my friend, where he coded, was resuscitated. Also, is that really famous trainer Bob Harper on TV shows, and real physically fit and muscular guy. Same thing, myocardial infarction, almost died. So and people ask me about the Maasai. Well, I've studied the Maasai too, and they did an autopsy study on about 50 of them. And they had a lot of atherosclerosis, especially in their aorta, but they were kind of a young population. There were hardly any persons over the age of 50 total patients studied. So it's hard to know, really, the true extent of atherosclerosis. And so that gets into all these subtle details. And I was impressed that, man, if a lion took one of their cattle, they'd go after the lion. Very brave. It's an interesting video if you ever watch that one. Maasai Man, check that out with the song. You'd be surprised how interesting that is. Anyways, getting back to olive oil. Olive oil can be oxidized. Even though it's only got one double bond, it's much more oxidizable than is saturated fat, but it's also much less oxidizable than the PUFAs with 2 or more double bonds. You don't want to get it in a plastic. I recommend don't get it at all, but it's even worse if it comes out of a plastic container because it can leach estrogens from the plastic like BPA and phthalates. So anything should be in a glass container, but it should not even be in your house would be my recommendation. It's going to be highly processed. Sometimes it's extracted with hexane. Hexane can have residues and be toxic. There's sort of articles going around on the internet about how extra virgin olive oil is better than olive oil, and sometimes there's like versions with more polyphenols, and they'll have some antioxidant component. And, be careful. There's industry-funded studies where they try to just set up a straw man argument where it'll be compared to things that are really unhealthy, so it'll look good in comparison, relatively speaking. But you want antioxidants, just eat plants, okay? A plant, let's say there's a person in a plant out in a hot field. It's 100 degrees outside. What does the person do? The person walks into the shade. So they can adjust their environment by movement. The plant can't move. All it can do is produce chemicals to protect itself from the sun. And that includes its antioxidants, and that's why plants have antioxidants. Let's see. Another thing about these olive oil and other oils, they increase clotting factor number 7, so they make the blood relatively prothrombotic. And, it's like Nick Delgado has said about what Pritikin said about oils. They're thick, they're viscous, they're a mess. Think about it when you clean up. And that's not exactly the same, but they're not good for blood flow. Okay, let's see, what else? Triglyceride number Felton article here. He looked at the composition of human aortic plaques and found a lot of omega-3 and omega-6 in some of these patients, and he felt that it corresponded to their diet, and he felt that it was due to their diet. It was his impression of the situation, and he felt that the favoring of dietary PUFAs should be reconsidered because there was a push to recommend PUFAs in the 1960s because they didn't increase cholesterol as much, but they still increased triglycerides except for the omega-3s. And there's other problems, but they're still atherogenic. The key point is they're still atherogenic. They're not going to make your blood flow significantly better. They're not going to help you to live longer. So why bother with them? They're more likely to make you fat. They're more likely to lead to insulin resistance. And I also just mentioned this one paper. I've talked about this paper before in the context of muscle membrane flip-flop mechanism with diabetes. Just that the skeletal muscle, is not able to control effectively the rate of fatty acid entry. So I think we're designed to eat small amounts of fat, what you get primarily in plant foods. And if there's some unusual occasion where more of them are available, like you're in season for avocados or nuts, I think the human body is designed that it can handle a brief episode of high fat intake, but on a daily basis, it's very damaging to the human body. I mean, we do have a gallbladder. There's a lot of herbivores, maybe the ones, if they're only eating grass all day, they don't even have a gallbladder. So the fact we do have a gallbladder, there's some hint that we've got, some ability to eat fats on a special occasion. But any routine consumption of high-fat meals is terrible for metabolism. It pushes you into the whole diabetes, tissue hypoxia spectrum. So in my opinion, I think it's a bad idea to eat olive oil. I recommend don't eat any olive oil, zero, none of these cooking oils. I mean, this is what Caldwell Esselstyn says. No oil, not one drop. If you want to optimize arterial health, which is a good idea for the sake of your brain and your heart and your Johnson, no oil. And like I said, the rule of thumb is could Adam and Eve eat this, or at least could our ancestors from a couple thousand years ago eat this? They had fire then. Okay, I don't know if Adam and Eve had fire. Whenever you hear all the foods in this category are bad except for one, be skeptical. So whenever somebody tells you all oils are bad except olive oil is good, be skeptical. All these billion-dollar foods, olive oil and caffeine and the rest of them, omega-3 fish oil, they all got all this industry-funded publicity, so don't be fooled by it. All right, in general, the categories of foods that are good: starches, fruits, and vegetables. That's the best thing to eat. Okay, so the references here, if you want to look any of this stuff up. Pretty good nutrition book, Advanced Nutrition and Human Metabolism book by Gropper. Caldwell Esselstyn, his famous paper on how to reverse coronary artery disease. from 2014. Of course, his book is great. Blankenhorn's paper, 1978. Cardiac cath follow-up. Didn't matter what type of fat they ate. Whatever fat they ate, it increased atherosclerosis. Sloop's the guy who wrote the book on viscosity. So all these dietary fats will increase blood viscosity, and they're all atherogenic. Omega-3 is a little special because it can reduce triglycerides, but it still ends up not being atheroprotective. Grassi's paper about clotting factor 7, more clotting factor 7 papers, paper about the fatty acids crossing the membranes and not being able to be controlled by the body. And then these are the Quo papers on, another Quo paper showed that vegetable oils cause a 20% decrease in blood oxygen. Yeah, great. It's a great way to make your tissues hypoxia, increase your risk of cancer, ischemia, myocardial infarction, and brain damage. Okay, so that's basically it. Hope that was helpful.